1993 was not a great year to be a fan of horror movies. Or at least that was the opinion of best friends and aspiring filmmakers Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick. In 1993, both Ed and Dan were students at the University of Central Florida studying filmmaking. They both loved scary movies and had dreams of making their own, but they also realized that the industry was on its deathbed at this point. The year is significant because 1993 is arguably the single worst year for horror movies. Let's take a look at some of the movies that were coming out around that time. There was Leprechaun. Yeah. And then there was yeah, that's kind of it. I mean, there were a few horror adjacent films that came out that year, like Hocus Pocus and The Nightmare Before Christmas, but I really wouldn't consider those genuine horror movies. The point is, this was a rough year for horror fans, Dan and Ed included. They didn't find these new movies scary, especially when compared to the classics like Kubrick's Shining and Carpenter's The Thing. In fact, they found documentaries on the paranormal, like Chariot of the Gods, The Legend of Boggy Creek, and In Search Of, to be a lot scarier than most of the conventional horror flicks that were coming out around this time. To Dan and Ed, what made these documentaries scary was the idea these entities could actually exist. The line between reality and fiction was blurred. This gave them an idea. What if they could combine the two? What if, instead of making a documentary on a real legend, they just created their own? What if they could convince people that what they were watching was real? They had a vision. Now the question was, how? How are they going to pull this off? There weren't exactly classes on how to fake a documentary at the University of Central Florida, so Dan and Ed knew they were going to have to figure this out on their own. They realized pretty quickly, though, that they're going to need some extra help if they're actually going to pull this off. So they recruited fellow UCF film students Greg Hale, Robin Cowie, and Michael Monello and started Haxan Films. After sustaining themselves for a few years making commercials for local businesses, they finally got started on their first feature film. They entered production in October of 1997, and then 2 years later, in 1999, we got to see their idea come to life in a feature film we now know as...
I'm scared to close my eyes.
Have you ever heard of the Blair Witch?
This is Burkittsville, formerly Blair.
Oh my God, what the fuck is that? Dude, what the fuck is that?
I kicked that fucking into the creek yesterday. It was useless. I kicked that fucker into the creek.
You've heard of the Blair Witch?
Mike, where you going? Oh shit. I'm scared to open them.
Stop! It's hanging all over! Look around!
No way. Don't fucking...
And turn the goddamn thing off!
You touch my camera, we're
Turn
I'll
that
fight you
thing
again.
Come on! I hear him downstairs!
When the Blair Witch Project premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January of '99, it left festival goers completely shocked. They had never seen anything so visceral, so terrifying, so real. The Blair Witch Project follows student filmmakers Heather Donahue, Michael Williams, and Joshua Leonard, who go missing in the Black Hills Forest near Burkittsville, Maryland, in search of a local legend known as the Blair Witch. Usually the audience at Sundance are given a quick synopsis and some background info on the movies they're about to watch. But for the Blair Witch, they got nothing. Although the film was categorized as a horror and not a documentary, the idea of found footage was still foreign to a lot of people. The Haxan crew even put up some missing people posters around the festival that depicted the actors as missing. Dan and Ed even had the actors lie low for a few months after the movie so no one would run into them by mistake and realize that it was all a hoax. The official IMDb page for the Blair Witch Project actually listed the actors as dead presumed missing for a whole year after the movie's release. A year before Sundance, Haxan launched a website featuring fake police reports, interviews with the victims' friends and family, character diaries, and news reports about the missing kids. Remember, the website went up a whole year before the movie was released, so if you just stumbled upon this on your own, you'd really have no reason to think this wasn't real. They also printed out alternate versions of the missing persons posters that would direct you to go to the website for more information. Haxan also made a number of bootlegs of the movie and passed it around amongst friends and family, in hope that it would generate some buzz and get people talking about it online, which it eventually did. News of the Blair Witch Project was catching on like wildfire. Even before its release, Blair Witch had gained a cult following. The Sundance release added more fuel to the fire and got people talking about this very real movie about these real people who really went missing in the woods. To add to this, 2 days before the movie was released to theaters, the Sci-Fi Channel aired The Curse of the Blair Witch, a mockumentary that goes in-depth into the mythos behind the Blair Witch, along with interviews with missing kids' friends and families. Now, of course, there were still some skeptics who had a hard time believing all this was real. Not everyone fell for it right away, but once they saw the movie, they became convinced that it was real too. Heather Donahue's real-life mother would actually receive sympathy cards over her daughter's disappearance. Meanwhile, the real Heather would be in the other room. Police stations were getting calls all throughout Maryland for people saying that they have leads on those missing Burkittsville kids. Most of the time, the cops had no idea what they were talking about. Some people actually went out into the real town of Burkittsville to see if they could join the search for the missing film students. Dan and Ed made it into their mission to trick people into thinking that the Blair Witch was real. And it worked. People fell for it. I don't think they ever could have imagined that it was going to reach the height that it did. Not since the infamous Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast back in 1938 had an audience of such a large magnitude believe something fictitious was actually real. The difference, of course, is Orson Welles wasn't really trying to trick people. Now, it's real easy in 2024 to sit there and wonder how we could have been so naive and fall for a hoax like this. Well, it's important to remember this was a time when we didn't quite understand that our computers could lie to us. This was before some of the infamous internet hoaxes like Bonsai Kitten or John Titor, the time-traveling blogger. So we hadn't learned by then that people can use the internet to lie. It also wasn't as easy back then as it is now to verify if something is fake. The Blair Witch Project was the first movie to use the internet as a marketing tool, and it's arguably one of the earliest examples of something going viral on the internet. It revolutionized the use of transmedia storytelling, which is the practice of telling a story over multiple media platforms. The use of transmedia storytelling has exploded over the last few years with the emerging popularity of ARGs. Some people have even called the Blair Witch Project the first ARG. While I do see where this comes from, I don't really think we'd classify the Blair Witch Project as an ARG. ARG stands for Alternate Reality Game. And yeah, the Blair Witch is definitely an alternate reality, but it's the game part of that acronym where we run into some issues. I don't think we could really categorize the Blair Witch as a game. At least not in the way we usually define the word game. It's more of a puzzle. All the pieces are already there. It's up to us to find them and piece together the story ourselves. So I guess in this way, it's more of an ARP rather than an ARG. And by the way, most quote-unquote ARGs would actually fall into this category as well. Whether you consider the Blair Witch Project as an ARG or not, there is no denying that it absolutely inspired the use of transmedia storytelling, and we likely wouldn't have gotten most of the ARGs we have today if it wasn't for the Blair Witch. Other movies have tried implementing various uses of transmedia storytelling to various degrees of success. Cloverfield had a very successful marketing campaign that started with a cryptic trailer that directed people to go to a website where they can learn more about the monster, much like Blair Witch. Probably the worst example of transmedia storytelling was in The Devil Inside, which just told you to go to the website at the end of the movie to understand the ending. There are more examples I can bring up, but I think you get the point. A lot of movies tried doing what Blair Witch did, and while some did reach some success with it, none did it to the level that the Blair Witch Project did. After Sundance, Haxton would receive an offer from Arson Entertainment for the distribution rights. Most other studios didn't want to risk putting money on something so experimental, but Artisan, being an independent company, was willing to risk it and paid Haxton around $1 million. After a few more test screenings and reshoots, the Blair Witch Project opened nationwide in July of 1999. The critics loved it, but audiences were a bit more split. Make no mistake, the Blair Witch Project is a very divisive movie. Most people either love it or hate it. There's very few in between. Horror, like most things in life, is subjective. What's scary to me may not be scary to you. A movie like Infested isn't really all that scary to me because I'm not that afraid of spiders. Now, sure, if I was in that situation, it would be terrifying. But for someone who has arachnophobia, who's terrified of just one spider, it would be infinitely more terrifying for them than it would be for me. Fear is universal, but what we fear is not. As someone who spent a lot of time in the woods, I know how terrifying they can be. The thought of being trapped in the woods with something I can't see that's stalking me is probably one of my worst possible nightmares. The woods are scary enough as it is, but to have something that you can't fully understand chasing you on top of that is beyond terrifying to me. Whereas most paranormal movies take place within a familiar-looking environment, Blair Witch puts the main characters out in the middle of nowhere, in the witch's very own backyard. That is, if there's even a witch at all. Maybe it's just a bunch of psychotic locals tormenting them, which, let's be real, wouldn't be all that much better. Regardless if it's a witch a human, or something else entirely, they are stuck in those woods. It's not like they can just walk out of a door and leave. They are completely stranded. There's no getting out of this nightmare. One of my biggest fears is the idea of being followed, so pairing that with being stuck in the woods is a deadly combination for me. But for someone who doesn't have those same fears, I can see how the Blair Witch Project could be boring to you. If you don't like this movie, that's completely fine. I do ask one thing of you though. Finish this video. Let me make a case for why you should give this movie another chance. You see, the Blair Witch Project was never meant to be watched on its own. It was meant to be a piece of a puzzle, so of course you're not going to see the full picture if you're only looking at one piece. You're only seeing a small glimpse into a much larger world. All I'm asking in this video is that you let me show you the other pieces of the puzzle. The story of the Blair Witch doesn't start with 3 kids walking to the woods. It starts earlier. Much earlier. In the year 1769, an Irish immigrant by the name of Ellie Kedward arrived in Baltimore. She would end up settling in Blair Township, where she would live for a number of years. Before coming to America, Ellie's life was one riddled with tragedy and misfortune. Ellie's mother bled out during childbirth, leaving the girl alone with her father. Ellie would live with her dad for a number of years. Or that was until Ellie and her father were captured by a group of rebels. The rebels tortured Ellie's father to death and forced her to watch it all. After they were done with her father, the rebels would go on to assault Ellie and throw her out into the cold when they were done with her. A grifter would end up finding Ellie walking around the streets by herself. She took the girl in and left her in an orphanage. Unfortunately, things would only get worse from here. Ellie would get abused and bullied by both the adults working at the orphanage and by the other orphans on a daily basis. It was around this time that Ellie would start to write in a journal. This was Ellie's only means of escape from the real world. She would have these fantasies where she's a powerful general among an army made out of these stick figures. She would describe these stick figures as her friends and her protectors against the beasts of the world. After spending a few years in the orphanage, Ellie would go live with an old hermit woman who taught her about the occult and witchcraft. Later on, Ellie ended up in an asylum where she would prostitute herself to make money. As a result, Ellie became pregnant on 7 separate occasions. Each of these pregnancies would result in a miscarriage. Ellie would continue to prostitute herself until she could afford to leave Ireland in hopes of starting over in a new country. Unfortunately, Ellie quickly ran into issues in her new home of Blair. Being a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant town, Ellie faced constant ridicule and persecution from the locals. Because of this, Ellie would spend most of her days in her house. Ellie would continue to practice witchcraft in secret. She knew that if anyone found out she was a witch, she can face serious consequences. Ellie knew she needed to lie low and not draw attention to herself. That was until, in February of 1785, when several town children accused Ellie of luring them into her home and drawing blood from them. It's unclear why Ellie would take blood from the kids. Some say she was making potions, or some say she used the blood for satanic rituals. But it's possible that the kids also could have made the whole thing up. No matter what the reason for the bloodletting was, Ellie is arrested for suspicion of practicing witchcraft. She is then put on trial. Dan and Ed took a lot of historical inspiration from the 1692 Salem witch trials, in which 25 women, men, and children were persecuted and many times killed for being wrongly accused of witchcraft. These people were completely innocent, and many of them lost their lives because of a lie started by one person. Also, here's a little fun fact for you. Haxan Films got their name from the 1922 silent documentary Haxan, which in English translates to Witchcraft Through the Ages. After her arrest, Ellie's put on trial and is banished from Blair Township, where she is to die out in the woods from exposure. The details around Ellie's death are a little cloudy. Some say she was blindfolded and dragged out in the middle of the woods. Some say she was tied to a tree and left to get eaten by the wolves. But the most popular theory is that the constables tied Ellie to a wagon and dragged her out in the middle of the woods to die from exposure. It was a particularly harsh winter that year, and Ellie likely wouldn't have lived past the night out in the woods. Like many aspects of the Ellie Kedward story, the details about what happened after Ellie was left in the woods are murky. Some say the constables went back into the woods the next day to bury her, but Ellie was completely missing. Some say she was torn apart by wolves, and others say that the same children who accused Ellie of drawing their blood went out and found that Ellie was still alive. They would torment her and slash her skin with sticks and sharp stones until she bled to death. A year after Ellie's death, in November of 1786, all of her accusers, along with half the town's children, go missing overnight. Search parties are sent out by the dozens, but the children are never seen again. The townspeople of Blair believe it was the spirit of Ellie Kedward getting her revenge on the children. The people believe that the town of Blair is cursed by Ellie, so they abandon the town and vow to never utter the name Ellie Kedward again. In November of 1809, the Blair Witch Cult was published. This mysterious book tells the origins of Ellie Kedward, and retells the legend of the missing Blair children. This book was used by members of the Blair Witch cult, a group of Satanists involved in witchcraft. They believe that they are followers of Ellie Kedward and receive special instructions from her in the Black Hills Forest. Not much detail is known about the cult themselves, but it's believed they were still around up until about the 1960s. After that, no one really knows what happened to them. The only known existing copy of the Blair Witch cult is on display in the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. The book is badly damaged and most of its contents are completely ineligible. But from what could be read, it seems that the Blair Witch cult believed that Ellie could control the animals and the trees within the Black Hills Forest. They believed that Ellie could control the elements and even time itself within the woods. Of course, all of this is speculation, and believed to be the crazed writings of a bunch of hippies out in the woods. In 1824, the town of Burkittsville was founded on the former Blair site. A year later, the citizens of Burkittsville were having a picnic by Tappy East Creek when 11 eyewitnesses testified seeing a pale woman's hand reach out from the water and pull 10-year-old Eileen Trickle into the creek. Despite the creek only being about 12 inches deep, Eileen's body was never found. For reference, Eileen could have crawled on her stomach across the creek without any problems. To make things even weirder, for 13 days straight after Eileen's disappearance, the creek was clogged up with these strange, oily stick figures. No one knew where these strange figures were coming from. A few cattle even died after drinking the water from the creek. The next event of interest happened in March of 1886, when an 8-year-old girl named Robin Weaver went missing into the Black Hills Forest. Multiple search parties go out into the woods to look for Robin. Eventually, she returns home by herself. All but one of the search parties comes back. So the search parties go back into the woods to look for the first group. They eventually find them at Coffin Rock. The search party was tied together by their hands and feet, with their bowels carved outside of their stomachs. There seemed to be some sort of pagan symbols carved into their skin. The search groups go back into town to get help. Once they go back to Coffin Rock, the bodies are completely gone. The smell of death still lingers. When the authorities questioned Robin about what happened, she said she was walking through the woods when she came across an old woman whose feet didn't touch the ground. The woman seemed nice, so Robin followed the woman into an old abandoned house. The old woman led Robin to the basement and said she'd return in a while. After a few hours, it was getting dark and Robin was starting to get scared, so she left and went back home. The next tragedy takes place in 1941, when an old hermit by the name of Rustin Parr walks into a local market and tells the people that he's finally finished. Not knowing what this meant, the police walked into the woods all the way to Rustin's secluded home, where they would find the remains of 7 young children who were slaughtered in the cellar of Rustin's home. Parr is immediately arrested and brought into questioning. He would tell the police that he was following the orders of a ghost woman who lives out in the woods. Over the course of 5 months, Parr would abduct children from the town and bring them back to his home to kill them. He abducted 8 children in total. Out of the 8 kids, there was only one survivor, a boy named Kyle Brody. Kyle was able to testify to what Parr did. Parr would make Kyle stand in the corner with his back turned to him facing the cellar wall, and he would force Kyle to stand there while he murdered all of the 7 children. It's kind of a funny coincidence when you think about it. 7 was also the number of pregnancies that Ellie Kedward miscarried. Maybe it's not such a coincidence after all. Strangely, Parr would never say why he decided to keep Kyle alive this whole time. It's unclear whether this was under direction of the witch. Initially, Parr pleaded guilty to his crimes and was sentenced to death. This may seem like a solid and open-shut case. However, before Parr was executed, he told a priest that he didn't actually kill anyone. This priest begged Parr to let him go to the judge, but Parr refused. He was hung to death on November 22, 1941. Many believe that Parr lied to the priest when he said he didn't kill anyone, but that begs the question, why would Rustin lie to the priest before his execution? He clearly wasn't trying to get out of dying, because he refused to let the priest go to the judge. Is it possible that Parr is innocent? Kyle Brody would go on to have a very troubled life after this. As an adult, Kyle was constantly in and out of prison and mental hospitals. He would draw these strange symbols on the walls of his cells. At first, the guards thought it was gibberish, but experts on the occult examined Kyle's writings and discovered that Kyle was writing in an ancient language. This mostly lost language is used primarily in witchcraft and secret societies. This is important because this same language was found written on the walls within Rustin Parr's home. The authorities assumed that Rustin had written on the walls himself, but there's only one problem with that. Rustin was illiterate. He couldn't read or write even in English, let alone an ancient language. Is it possible Kyle Brody may have had more to do with the other kid's death than he was letting on? Was Rustin Parr covering for Kyle? Were they working together? This opened the door to a lot of new questions. Unfortunately, Kyle Brody would end up taking his life in 1971 after slitting his wrist with a sharpened spoon. This brings us to the events of October 20th, 1994, when 3 Montgomery College film students, Heather Donahue, Joshua Leonard, and Michael Williams, arrived in Burkittsville to make a documentary on the legend of the Blair Witch. The group interviewed some locals about the Blair Witch, where they would learn about Ellie Kedward and Rustin Parr. The next day, the trio would enter to the Black Hills Forest, where they were never seen or heard from again. An APB is put out on October 25th, and search parties are sent into the Black Hills Forest to look for the missing kids. Shortly after, Joshua Leonard's car is found parked on the side of Black Rock Road. The next day, on the 26th, the Maryland State Police join in on the search. The search would last over 10 days, where over 100 people would walk into the forest to try and find these kids. They used hunting dogs, helicopters, and even a satellite from the Department of Defense to try and find them. But nothing ever came out. It's as if the filmmakers walked into the woods and simply fell off the face of the earth. Over 30,000 hours of work went into this search, and nothing. It was officially called off on November 5th. On June 19th of 1995, the case was declared inactive, despite protests from Heather Donahue's mother, Angie. For a while, it seemed like that was where the story was going to end. Or, that wasn't until, on October 16th, when students from the University of Maryland's anthropology department discover a duffel bag containing film cassettes underneath the foundation of Rustin Parr's house. This bag with modern video cameras and various other equipment was found underneath the foundation of an over 100-year-old house, and none of the surrounding walls were disturbed. There wasn't a single brick out of place. That means somehow, some way, this bag was buried underneath this century-old house without any part of the ground or the house itself being disturbed or showing signs of being changed. How could that be possible? Out of all the seemingly strange details that surround this case, this is the one that's the hardest to explain. After the tapes were discovered, they were handed over to Burkittsville Sheriff Ron Cravens. After the Sheriff Department confirms that the tapes actually belong to the missing kids, they showed selected pieces of the tapes to the students' families. The footage they were shown proved to be inconclusive. The family demanded to see more footage. After reviewing more of the tapes, the Sheriff Department declares that the tapes were faked by the missing kids and declared the case to be inactive again. Heather Donahue's mother, Angie, is outraged and demands the family see the rest of the tapes. This led to a year-long legal battle, and by the end, Angie won. The full footage was finally released to the students' families on October 16, 1997. With over 20 hours of footage to go through, Angie knew that she was going to need some help to piece everything together. This is when Angie contacts Haxon Films to examine the footage and piece together the events of October 20th to the 28th of 1994. After months of going through the footage and trying to make sense of it all, the Haxon crew was able to put together what they felt best explained what happened to the kids, and they called it the Blair Witch Project. This is how urban legends start. Tragedy will strike, and instead of accepting that bad things happen for no good reason sometimes, we like to think that there's some monster behind them all. Did Eileen Treckle really get pulled into the creek, or did she drown due to negligence? Robin Weaver could have easily made up a story of the floating woman to stay out of trouble. Was Rustin Parr really following the orders of a ghostly woman, or was he just trying to make himself look crazy in hopes that he can escape the death sentence? Is there even a witch at all? Or is the Blair Witch merely just a scapegoat? Admittedly, there's a lot of strange occurrences within the Blair Witch legend that would make it hard to explain without some kind of supernatural phenomena. To me, what makes the Blair Witch Project so fascinating is how it was made. Dan and Ed knew in order to trick people into thinking what they were watching was real, they were going to need to make it feel real. That meant they weren't going to be able to produce this like a normal movie. The most important thing, the backbone of the project, if you will, was the actors. Dan and Ed knew that they're going to need people who can actually improvise under any scenario. They didn't need people who can read off a script because, well, there was no script. They needed the dialogue to feel organic. They needed people who could stay in character under any circumstance, and more importantly, they need people who can think in character too. During the auditions, instead of feeding the actors lines of dialogue, the directors gave them a scenario. The actors were told that they had been in jail for the last 9 years, and they had to make a case to their parole board as to why they should be let out. That was it. That was the only thing they got to work with. Originally, Dan and Ed only wanted men for each part, but they were so impressed with Heather's audition that they ended up hiring her on the spot. Most of the scenes in the woods were shot in Seneca Creek State Park in Montgomery County, Maryland. Filming lasted 8 days, and the last day of shooting was actually on October 31st, 1997. Ironic, isn't it? The actors shot most of the film themselves, using a CP16 camera and a Hi8 tape recorder, both of which were bought from secondhand stores a few days before filming began. Producer Greg Hale, who had experience traversing through the woods from his military training, set up checkpoints filled with food, water, and direction notes throughout the woods that the actors had to find with their GPS. Once they would reach these checkpoints, which were milk crates marked with bicycle flags, they'd be given directions on where to go next and what their characters were going to do. Each actor was given their own direction notes, and they weren't allowed to show the other actors. Dan and Ed knew that in order to get the most genuine reactions out of their performers, They needed it to feel as if they were really out in the woods themselves. The only time the crew would come in and give directions verbally is if the trio had missed a checkpoint or started walking in the wrong direction, which actually happened quite a lot. They wanted to make the actors physically uncomfortable being out in the woods, so their fear felt more genuine. This included feeding the actors a little less food day by day to simulate the feeling of starvation. Tax and crew made it very clear to the trio that while they were going to be very concerned about their safety, they were not going to be so concerned about their comfort. This was done to make the acting feel more natural. It's easier to pretend you're hungry when you're, in fact, actually hungry. Over the course of 8 days, Heather, Mike, and Josh were out in the woods, and they had shot over 18 hours of footage. Most of it unusable, but Dan and Ed still had a lot of tape to go through. Now, something that's important to understand is that Dan and Ed did not set out to make a found footage movie. They wanted to make a documentary. The footage shot in the woods was just phase 1. Phase 2 is going to be much more straightforward. Interviews, newsreels, things like that. Originally, the students' tapes were only going to make up about 15 to 20 minutes of the original movie. But during the editing process, which took over 8 months by the way, Dan and Ed slowly realized that they had a full movie just with the students' footage. They didn't need anything else. They decided to remove all the documentary parts and use them for Curse of the Blair Witch instead. The version of the Blair Witch Project we see today wasn't the original cut. Arson felt that the original ending, while scary, was too confusing for the audience. They had requested that they reshoot the ending and change it up. Dan and Ed actually brought Mike back to the Rustin Parr house and filmed 4 alternative endings. Ending 1 is similar to the first one, except Heather gets a lot closer to Mike and we see some of the witch's dolls hanging from the ceiling. The second ending has Mike facing forward, more in a kind of trance. This one is definitely more startling than the first. Mike is staring Heather down in a very aggressive way, almost indicating that he's under the witch's influence. The third ending has Mike hanging from the ceiling with a noose around his neck, and the fourth, probably the most infamous alternate ending, sees Mike crucified on a giant stick doll hanging from the ceiling. Artisan ran more test screenings to see which ending scored the best, and ironically, it was the OG ending, the one Artisan hated. Luckily, Artisan listened to put the original ending back in. While it's true that the original ending is definitely more confusing, I think that's kind of what made it scary in the first place. The more we understand something, the less scared we become. What makes us fearful is something that's out of the ordinary, unexplained. The first ending kept the audience off balance. It challenged our real-world conventions. That's what really makes it scary. After the theatrical release, the Blair Witch Project exploded in popularity. It is to this day one of the most successful indie films of all time. But like I said earlier, audiences were still split on it. I think the found footage format was just a little too foreign for people to understand. There was actually even some people who were legitimately disappointed to discover that it was all a hoax. I think they felt ripped off in a way. There were also some reports that the jumpy camera work made people feel sick and even caused a few people to vomit during the movie, although this was pretty rare. Like I said earlier, the critics loved this movie and pretty much gave it universal praise. In fact, Roger Ebert, who notoriously hated scary movies, gave it 4 stars, and in his review called it an extraordinarily effective horror film. Whether you like this movie or not, there is no denying the impact the Blair Witch Project had within the horror landscape, especially within the found footage genre. Blair Witch is not the first found footage horror movie. That accolade would go to 1980's infamous Cannibal Holocaust, and there were a couple more before Blair Witch as well. But it was the first movie to bring the genre to the mainstream. And then in 2007, the monumental success of Paranormal Activity revitalized the genre, and it helped studios realize the potential this formula had. Since then, found footage has become one of the most well-known and profitable subgenres in all of horror. Admittedly, I don't like most found footage horror movies. There are exceptions, of course, but as a whole, I can't really say it's one of my favorite genres. I've noticed that in a lot of found footage movies, they'll usually treat the camera like it's an afterthought. And what I mean by that is, they'll explain why there's a camera in the beginning. Usually it's for some kind of documentation. And then outside of that very brief explanation, they never really address it again. You feel like everyone in that movie is just oblivious to the fact that there's a camera pointed directly at them. It's like the person holding the camera has become invisible. I also have a hard time imagining that the camera person would just continually put themselves in harm's way to get everything on camera, rather than just throwing the camera down and trying to get away from the danger. Even if it's for documentation. I mean, even the most professional documentarians still have their limits. Most found footage movies are going to kind of ignore this. But you see, Blair Witch Project doesn't do that. It actually addresses the issue head on. And I think the way it does it makes a lot of sense. We know that Heather is a very insecure person, but she pretends to be a lot stronger than she really is. She's also a control freak who needs to constantly be in charge of everything around her. The problem with people like this is that when they're thrown into a situation they have no control over, their mask starts to break and they crumble. Heather is using her camera as a sort of shield. When she's looking through the lens, she isn't really seeing the real world. She's seeing a distorted mirror world where she can still pretend that everything's okay. It's the very last thing that Heather has control over. Without her camera, she has nothing. So why do I love this movie but not like some of the others? Well, I think I know a way I can answer that. We're going to be taking a look at the second Blair Witch movie. Oh, no, not this one. Not this one. Oh, yeah, there we go. That's actually not all that much better. Okay, all jokes aside, Blair Witch 2016 is better than Book of Shadows. But that's not saying much. This is still a bad film. Not only is it a poor Blair Witch sequel, it's just a bad movie all around. I know, this one does have its fans. And if you're one of those people, then I'm sorry, but you're probably not going to like what I'm going to have to say. In fact, the only reason why we're even going to be talking about it is because I think this movie perfectly embodies everything wrong with the found footage genre. If the Blair Witch Project is considered our gold standard of how to make a found footage horror movie, then Blair Witch 2016 is going to be your how not to make a found footage horror movie. Probably the worst aspect of this film to me is its over-reliance on jump scares. And let me be crystal clear on this. These are some of the most egregiously bad and lazy jump scares I have seen in any horror film. This is something that plagues most found footage movies. The filmmakers think that since we see everything from the character's point of view, that's a free invitation just to throw as much lazy crap at the camera as they can. Look, when it's used sparingly, it could be an effective tool to catch someone off guard and get their tensions up, right? But when it's overused like it is in Blair Witch, it gets old really fast. In comparison, the first film didn't have any jump scares whatsoever. Instead, it relies on the atmosphere to install this feeling of dread within the viewer. It feels like something's going to jump out at you, but it never does. With traditional horror flicks, there's a natural sense of relief after a jump scare. It's the build-up that's the scary part. What the Blair Witch Project does so brilliantly is it makes it feel like there's something coming up that whole time, but it never does. So the whole time you're watching it, you feel the tension building up and up and up, but there's never any release. It feels like an anxiety disorder. You're waiting for something to happen and you don't know when it will. So you have to constantly be on guard, but in the back of your head, you're hoping the big scare comes because then you'll be able to relax afterwards. From beginning to end, you feel like you need to constantly be on guard. This makes it a lot easier to relate to the characters too. Like Heather, Josh, and Mike, we have no idea where the witch is, but we know she's there, toying with us, waiting, watching. This is why the first film is so scary to me, even after multiple rewatches. The tension is always there. The dread builds up slowly to the point where you're almost wishing that something will happen so you can already get it over with. But in 2016's case, well, if I ever watch it again, what do I have to be afraid of? I already know when all the big jumps happen, so now what? What are you going to do to scare me? This is why suspense and atmosphere will always win over a jump scare any day. I think another problem this movie has is with its identity. It doesn't know what it wants to be exactly. It's supposed to be a sequel, but it feels like it's trying to be a remake. It's a blatant copy and paste that tries to recreate scenes from the OG movie while failing to understand what made those scenes scary in the first place. Look, say what you will about Book of Shadows. Yeah, it's a bad film, but at least it tries to be different. It wasn't trying to rip off the first movie. It actually did bring in some new ideas. They weren't necessarily good ideas, but they were new. 2016 brings nothing to the table. They did try to implement elements of body horror into this film, and while I am a big fan of body horror, it's one of my favorite subgenres, I don't know, it just felt so out of place here. But the biggest sin this film commits, by far, is that it actually shows the Blair Witch on camera. What made the first film actually scary, what made it so uncomfortable, and what made it so dreadful was this feeling of being hunted by something you can't see and you can't reason with. It's the Jaws effect. We can't see the shark, but we know it's there. It could be anywhere. It could be underneath the boat right now waiting for its chance to strike. That is horror. Even if it's not a witch out in those woods, even if it's a group of people or some other monster, whatever it is, it's always going to be scarier in our minds than what could ever be put on a screen. There's no limit to what our minds can create, but there is a limit to what we can show in a movie. Once that seal is broken, once the monster in your head doesn't match up what your eyes are looking at, that mystery is dead. There's nothing left to be afraid of. The Blair Witch was never about the witch herself. Not really. It's about paranoia. It's about the tricks your mind plays on you. It's about the monsters we create in our own heads. And this is where 2016 fails miserably. I think the great Roger Ebert said it best himself. At the time when digital techniques can show us almost anything, the Blair Witch Project is a reminder that what really scares us is the stuff we can't see. The noise in the dark is almost always scarier than what makes the noise in the dark. You'd think by now, the studios would have learned their lessons. They tried to revive the Blair Witch universe twice and it failed each time. But of course, that's never how the story goes, does it? Apparently, there's a remake in the works. Now, I'm not a fortune teller, so I could be wrong, but I can tell you with a lot of confidence that this remake, reboot, whatever they're gonna call it, it's gonna fail. The first movie, it was like lightning in a bottle. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. This film not only redefined a whole genre, it redefined how we look at filmmaking. It showed us that there's more than one way to tell a story. If you're still not a fan of the Blair Witch Project, that's fine. I don't think there's anything I really could have said that was going to change your mind. But I do hope you can see why this film is so important, especially in the world of horror. This is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of film. This was our War of the Worlds. I don't think we're going to get anything else like it for a very, very long time. If you made this far into the video, then I just want to say thank you. I ask that you leave a like, a comment, subscribe, because there's going to be a lot more like this to come. It's been a while since I've uploaded, a couple months, and I'm sorry for that. This video ended up being a lot bigger than I initially thought it was going to be, and I just hope that it shows in the end. But I appreciate the patience, and I appreciate you guys always being here and supporting. It means a lot more than you'd know. If you'd like to support me, then please consider checking out the Patreon, where you can get access to a bunch of awesome features, like all my videos early and uncensored, access to our exclusive channel Discord, and weekly and monthly video and channel updates. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. See ya.
I am so scared when people don't label their personal food.